Another early Gibson archtop. I've worked on a number of these in the past few years, and I've become quite fond of them. There actually seems to be a bit of an upswing in the appreciation for these oval hole designs. You know, for the longest time they've been downgraded simply because they don't have F-holes. You know, they're not an L5, in other words. However, I recall an interview with Bob Benedetto, who is one of the most respected builders of jazz archtops in the last 50 years, in which he was asked a question about these old designs, and he sort of bemoaned the fact that he'd never had enough time to experiment with them. You know, like most successful archtop builders, once the waiting list gets going, they become locked into making the same thing over and over and over again, and it's really hard for them to break out of it. Everyone wants the sort of classic design. But he saw a lot of potential in these that wasn't ever really fulfilled, because once the F-hole design was established, that's all anyone felt like buying. You know, there's a certain amount of peer pressure, obviously. Everyone wanted to play the usual looking thing. Ken Parker, too. Ken is making some fantastic videos here on YouTube these days. He's most known as the designer of the Parker Fly solid body guitar. Well, kind of solid body. But he was and is primarily at heart an archtop person, and he has great affection for these early Gibsons as well. And just a few months ago, the Guild of American Luthiers Journal featured an article by a Dutch luthier, Sjaak Elmendorp, who has been using this model as a basis for his current builds. So you never know. The world turns, the appreciation shifts, and prices go up. This is the oldest of these guys that I've worked on. It's an L3, which is the fancy model, which simply means it's got a little bit of extra inlay on the headstock here and some decoration in the sound hole ring. It's from 1918, which means it predates the introduction of the truss rod. There's nothing there. You know, that was a big thing. Thaddeus McHugh patented the idea in 1921. Gibson had it in production by 1922. And the truss rod, of course, allows you to build a neck and hold it within a certain set of parameters, even though it's going to change through the year due to shifts of humidity and temperature. Prior to that, a guitar neck with steel strings on it was really at the mercy of the elements. You know, you can try and use the straightest grain possible and orient it perfectly in the neck blank before you carve it. But you're pretty much, you know, you have to accept the fact the neck is going to do some funny things sometimes, especially if you're building a bunch of them. One way to try and make the neck more stable was to increase the physical size, you know, improve the beam strength. Because if you change the thickness of a board of wood, the stiffness will change too, but it's by a cube. It's a function of the cube of that dimension. So it's not like if you double the height it gets twice as stiff. It's actually 8 times more stiff. And on a neck like this, which starts off pretty chunky at the nut end, by the time you're up to like the 9th fret, this is, I think, a good 36 millimeters thick, which is almost twice what a normal neck or modern normal neck would be. So, you know, I've mentioned it before, even with big hands, these can offer a bit of a challenge. Now this one to me feels slightly more V-shaped than others I've worked on. The thing is, even with all that extra mass in the neck, sometimes they take on strange shapes that can't be adjusted out, because there's no truss rod. And you pair that with these very small vintage frets, and you have kind of the recipe for disappointment, which is what we got here, because there's enough waviness that I can't dress out, because the frets simply aren't tall enough to take care of it. I'd be into the wood. So, you know, it's refret time. This is not the original bridge. This is not the original tailpiece. That's not too unusual. The original bridge is very limited adjustability, and the tailpieces on these, up until the early 20s, were actually, they were again a wire tailpiece, quite lightweight, but they had a beam across here that was made up of celluloid, tortoise shell colored celluloid, and bridge pins, like you would find on a flat top acoustic guitar. Now, of course, the celluloid is prone to rot, and they tend to fall apart, and it's a big chunk of celluloid, which is very difficult to get your hands on these days, so more often than not, these things have been replaced with something, and this is actually quite nice. I don't mind that at all. The top is deformed slightly. It's gotten flatter in the center, such that the bridge has been raised quite high above its base, to the point where I kind of want to graft on some material to this base to make it thicker and look a little less ungainly. You want some support there around the screws. The soundboard, as I said, is kind of misshapen, but it's in one piece. It's not cracked. Doesn't seem to be in danger of absolutely collapsing, so we'll likely leave that as it is. We also need to find a way to amplify this one. This is for a jazz player. Most of these I've refurbished for blues guys, but he wants to use heavy, flat-wound jazz strings, you know. In the past I've messed with, you know, pickguard mounted acoustic pickups. In this case we're not putting the pickguard on it, and I want something a little bit different. You know, there are some challenges because the sound hole is small, smaller than your typical guitar, and the available sound hole mounted pickups just can't fit in there. And I'm going to confess, I don't think the character of something like a soundboard mounted transducer that sticks to the underside is really going to fit the sonic requirements of this case for jazz play. So a little bit of head scratching, I came up with this. This is a bladed humbucker. It's a pickup which has been miniaturized and designed to fit into the space of your standard Strat single coil. And the blades mean that I don't really have to worry too much about the pole piece spread, which is apt to be a little non-standard. And the mounting holes in this just clear the inside binding on the sound hole, so it'll fit. Also, when installed, the thickness of this pickup is going to be really nice with the sort of neck angle we've got here in the available space, because there won't be a whole lot of up-down adjustability. Yeah, so I'm going to have to make a mounting plate that's going to hold it in place, and we'll add some controls too. I'll install a jack, and we should end up with a useful musical tool. The nut has the unusual attribute of 2 string slots for the high E. You get to choose your own adventure for string spacing. I don't really like either of them. Fret height, 22 thousandths of an inch. It's a little too low. So, as usually the case, these very old ebony boards from more than a century ago tend to be kind of chippy, so I want to make sure that I score along the line of each fret on both sides to try and prevent as much chip out as possible. I'll heat them up with a soldering iron. I have to go side saddle this time because the frets are so low that if I put the little divot that I've got on my soldering iron in the center of the fret, it would likely touch the board. I don't want that. And the frets came out without too much complaint. The nut would just get in the way when I was trying to dress the board, so I've got to get rid of it. I'm just checking to see whether it's been lacquered over. There are a series of shims under it, so I don't imagine that it's much of a problem. I actually cut into those shims there. But I'll just score the lacquer behind it to make sure it doesn't crack or anything. Just give it a little bonk. That came out fine. And you can see the thickness of the shims. A very irregular landing spot. I'll use a straight edge to get a picture of what's actually going on the board. Turns out there's a bit of a double wave and a pretty massive hump at the body joint there. Okay, the relief on the board is about 8 thousandths. That's just the fingerboard with no string tension. This has also got a really irregular radius on it. I've noticed this in other Gibsons of this period. They don't seem to really have a standard. I'm not exactly sure how they put that radius in there. You know, at points it looks like it's a 10 or 12, but it's not consistent. It's not a pure radius. It'll be, you know, quite steep on the ends, then there'll be a bit of a dip, and there'll be a flat spot in the center which is lower. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm tempted to just make it a 12. I think that's probably a good solution. We'll just reprofile it to a straight 12-inch radius. I'll start off by sanding things relatively straight and getting rid of some of the big dips and bumps. At the nut end of the board, there's an area here that drops off precipitously. And I mean, it's not a little bit, it's scooped. It's almost like, I think it's almost like snipe from a thickness planer. Because it's got to be 5-6 thousandths at least. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to sand my way through that. I'll make it smooth, but it's going to have to remain. I'll get out the radius sanding block and start reshaping it. There are still some dips and bumps and weird stuff going on. I can't emphasize just how wonky this fretboard was. The other thing is I don't want to sand down into the side dot markers in the binding, which looks weird. So I'm being as conservative as I can be here, just getting rid of the eccentricity and not going for an absolutely perfect surface cosmetically, but it'll be straight. There's already a natural fall away present in the fingerboard extension, but I will make this compound radius using a 16-inch down at this end here, blending the two together. I'm pointing out that there's a little flat spot remaining there around fret 15 or 16, which I have to get rid of still. The original frets on this guitar are quite tiny in every respect. You can see that these have the sort of serrated look to the tangs. They don't have little sections punched out sideways. Instead, they've been machined or punched on the very end here into a kind of serration, which deforms them enough to hold in the slot. However, I mean, usually that is not an issue, but the depth frequently is. Especially now that I have reshaped or recontoured the top of the board. These guys are about 50 thousandths tall in terms of the tang height. And the ones I'm going to use are probably closer to 60 thousandths. So I'm definitely going to have to deepen the fret slots. I have this little doohickey here, which has a number of radii on the outside, and you can sort of check and see what the slot depth is, especially on a board like this that's got binding on the sides. It'd be kind of difficult to measure, and just looking at the lines that are inscribed on it, I can tell that I will have to deepen these slots. Also, I can feel that there are some bumps and perhaps some glue on the bottom of some of these. So to deepen the slot, I'm going to use a 0.6 millimeter little spiral carbide bit. Very skinny, and as you can see here, I've got my lineup of soldiers. They do break on occasion. 0.6 millimeters is about 23 thousandths of an inch. So these will fit in the slots. It'll probably take me, well, at least 2 passes to get down to 60 thousandths, 1.5 millimeters, which is the depth I want. Here's a good secondary use for a string action gauge. I've wrapped a little flag of tape around the bit, and this acts as a fan, which clears away the dust as it's being cut. This requires steady hands but a light touch, and you have to sort of sight along the slot almost like a rifle. You want your eye in line so that you can see what's going on at the point of cut. And if you've got the Dremel or similar machine running at absolute top speed, it tends to sort of float along and do what you want it to do. If you go too slow, there'll end up being problems. You'll veer off into the side of the fretboard that you don't want to cut, and that kind of thing. I guess what I'm saying is it requires a little bit of practice. I've bent the fret wire into a radius, and I'll cut off individual frets of the correct length. Before installing the frets, I go along with a little 3-corner file and just break the hard corners at the top of each slot. This makes the frets go in easier and makes them come out much cleaner if they ever have to come out again. And then I must needs cut the little relief notch at the end of each fret so that it can overhang the binding, using some fret tang nippers. I'll hammer these home. I tend to, on boards without a truss rod, stagger the frets as I put them in. I'll do fret 1, then fret 11, fret 6 and then fret 13. This seems to keep the neck straighter, or at least it will on a fretboard. To this staggered approach rather than doing them all one at a time, like in line. I don't know. Just a thing I do. When the glue in the slots has had time to dry, I'll snip off the ends. I'll file an angle into the ends and trim them back so they're flush with the edge of the board. This is a file holder I made. I'll put on some nasty old strings and tune them to pitch because this has to go in the neck jig, which will simulate the string tension while I dress the tops of the frets and keep the guitar in the same shape it is under usual working conditions. This is sort of where the neck jig excels in a guitar with no truss rod. In years past, you might take 2 or 3 times to get a usable fret plane, and in the process you end up scrubbing off half the height of the fret. In this case, we can get it done the first time and have reliable results. Crowning, crowning, crowning. Polishing, polishing, polishing. Zipping off the sharp corners. And shining up the facets at the end of the frets. I cut a nut blank to length, and here I'm measuring the distance from the edge of the board to where the outside string should be, with hands covered in bone dust and ebony. We'll saw some starter marks for each string and then go at them with the fret files. With the fret ends all shaped and polished up, I just need to give the board some oil. The back of this guitar is in worse shape than the front. You can see that there are 3 fairly long cracks that run through. This is a birch back. Most of these guitars were birch in this stage. The cracks are pretty good and tight, so I'll dab on a whole bunch of glue, pump it through with the suction cup, then I'll add more glue and do this again. I'll wipe up most of the excess. Then I'll get a whole bunch of homemade clamps on there from side to side and up and down. Try to make sure everything's as level as it can be. It's time to make some little cleats to support those cracks from the inside of the instrument. Before I glue those in, I need to clean off some space for them to sit because there's 100 years worth of dirt on the back of the guitar. So I'll scrub that away with some naphtha. I'll put on a little dollop of glue. You can see I've got the cleat held in a clamp, hemostats. And because this is, again, a very small sound hole, I've got to kind of wiggle my way down to where it should be, and, well, it's just fun is all, That's what it looks like all stitched up. To make the clamping device for the pickup, I've got this sheet of tortoise-colored acrylic, which is about 2 millimeters thick. It's an offcut from a pickguard, and I'll use that. I need to whip up a quick routing jig that'll be the right size. This pickup, being on the modest side and not a custom creation from a large American manufacturer, required a little bit of finessing. The holes in the base plate hadn't been tapped for the screws that came with it. I guess they expected the screws themselves to tap it. I wanted to be a little bit more careful than that, and took out my 440 tap and proceeded to tap those by hand. I've carefully marked out the position of the hole that's going to be in the center of the pickup device, and I'm going to super glue that to the bottom of the template. I'm using a 3/8 inch radius template cutting bit, which is smaller than what you'll find in the hardware store. These are available from StewMac. This requires just a series of light passes and not trying to hog out too much waste at one time, because of course the template is kind of tentatively stuck on there with just a little bit of glue. I don't want to displace it and mess up the work. Just a little wrestling and it comes free. I'm happy with it. I'll need to clean up the edges with some filing and sanding, but it seems to fit appropriately. The holes line up, which is a good thing. I'll just put a little bit of radius on the corners using a file. Then I'll sand everything up to exceedingly fine grits. On to the controls. This is a volume tone. Got a little capacitor in there. This is from Shatton Designs. This is usually used for acoustic pickups. With a little more space in the sound hole, I've really got to cram everything in there to get it fit. Here I am soldering or soldering the legs of the capacitor. There are instructions for a number of different configurations. It's pretty straightforward. I'll screw the pickup bracket into place. This is keying off the inside plastic ring of the rosette on the inside of the sound hole. Good solid material. Doesn't look like it's going to dent anything. And as I mentioned, positioning the controls inside the sound hole is not an easy task in this guitar because the braces really are kind of confounding. This guitar is a hybrid of sorts. It's got the two long parallel braces we see in most jazz guitars and several transverse ones, like ladder bracing. There's one near the bridge and two more on both sides of the sound hole, kind of boxing it in. The central brace doesn't continue all the way across and get housed in the lining. It just sort of resolves into nothing in the middle of the soundboard, perhaps to keep those edges free and give you some more pumping action. This device doesn't take up a lot of room, but there is not enough room really for it. It's going to stick out a little bit farther into the sound hole space, but I don't really mind because, again, the sound hole itself is so small that the controls are going to be under the strings. I don't anticipate they're going to get a whole lot of use. This is sort of tailor the sound to the way you like it and then just plug in and go. Working on the bridge base now. I've glued on about 1/8 of an inch worth of rosewood onto the top of it, having drilled holes for the bridge posts. I'll trim off the excess on both sides. I'll sort of blend the curve into the side of the upper portion of the post from the wing using a dowel with some sandpaper wrapped around it. There we have it. The color is still mismatched as it was in the beginning, but it looks a little more, I don't know, proportional now. Still plenty of room for adjustment. Yeah, just like it better. I made a new nut, something I've shown a lot in recent weeks. You get the picture. Okay, this thing is ready to go. These always take a long time. They seem to take longer than I anticipate every time. A lot of work to get them in shape. So, we got frets that you can play from one end of the board to the other. We've got nice low action. It's 4/64 bass and treble. We've got a bridge bass with a little more meat on it. Less likely to have the posts tip one way or the other. A pickup. Some controls. The back is not full of open cracks anymore. And a new nut. What's not to like? This guitar predates electronic amplification, obviously. It's a couple of years older than commercial radio. And the design itself predates what we'd consider a modern concept of jazz. Like, the word wasn't even in use when this was designed. It always kind of blows my mind. These early Gibson archtops are kind of substantially different from guitars that Orville Gibson initially designed. He had some rather idiosyncratic and kind of clunky concepts about the guitar. But when they shifted and started doing these, they got a lot right with them, right out of the gate. They're appealing. So let's give it a whirl.